Welcome, everyone. Our webinar today is about to start. So I'm now passing the floor to Deanna Ramsey, our moderator. Deanna, you may have the floor.
Okay, hello and welcome to this inaugural event in our just launched webinar series hosted by the Enhanced Integrated Framework, or EIF, which is housed at the World Trade Organization in Geneva. EIF works to support trade and development in the world's 47 least developed countries, and there are also 4 that have recently graduated. And these are countries from Asia to the Pacific to Africa. And this is all with the goal to create jobs and alleviate poverty in those countries. As just mentioned by my colleague, my name is Deanna Ramsey. I will be your moderator here today. I am the managing editor of EIF's Trade for Development News. And I just want to thank you all again for joining us here today to delve into this really globally pressing topic, looking at how COVID-19 is impacting the world's most fragile states. The World Bank has recently come out with a report estimating that soon enough, a majority of the world's poor will be living in fragile and conflict-affected states. So we're talking about places like Yemen, like South Sudan, like Haiti, places that are dealing with conflict, with recovery from violence, vulnerability to disasters. And in the COVID-19 context, of course, these are also places with weak healthcare systems. I'd like to introduce, we have a wonderful panel of speakers here today. First is His Excellency Mohammad Qurban Haqjo, who is ambassador and permanent representative to the World Trade Organization from Afghanistan. We also have Luisa Bernal, who is a policy specialist with the United Nations Development Program. And we have Paul Brenton, who is lead economist in the macroeconomics, trade, and investment global practice at the World Bank Group. So the ambassador and Luisa, I believe, are joining us from Geneva. Paul is coming in from Washington, D.C. I am in right now a very small town in Kansas. And I'd also just like to give a shout out to everyone who's joining us here today, because we were so happy to see so many people registering from so many countries across the globe, from Bangladesh to the UK, from China to the Solomon Islands. It's really, really nice to have such a diverse audience joining us. And that leads me into a few just quick housekeeping notes. We are aiming for the majority of the time today to really be a discussion, a conversation, and taking questions from you all, because we really want to be talking about the issues that you all think are the most important. So please do use the Q&A function in your Zoom window at the bottom, and I will be curating those questions. You are free to do so anonymously. If you do submit with your name, I'll just be using your first name. And second, we will be having 2 polls throughout this very quick 1-hour webinar. The first will just start off right now. So if we could get that poll question up on the screen, that would be great. Okay, so you should all see the poll. It's just a very easy multiple choice question. And I ask the audience, please, to just have a read through and select what you think, again, is the most critical response needed to support vulnerable populations to have a voice and to build their resilience in the context of COVID-19. So I'll just give you all a few more seconds to answer. I see the answers coming in. Great. Wow, I'm seeing a lot of answers coming in, so I'm giving you guys a few more seconds. Okay, maybe we can just stop there. I don't want to cut you off, but I'm going to end the poll right now. Okay, great. So we have a nice balance, I think, of some responses, but it looks like the majority of you, well, we have some very even responses, believe that working through international organizations with in-country efforts is much needed. Oh, and then of course, addressing the structural causes of conflict. Also, we got a lot of responses. Okay, so moving on. I'm going to hand it over right now to Ambassador Haqjo. Ambassador, please.
Hello, Diana. Thank you very much for the opportunity. Let me begin by saying good morning or good evening, good afternoon to all our audience and also my fellow distinguished panelists. It's a great honor for me to speak today in this webinar, and I want to thank the EIF for organizing this very timely manner and on a very important topic indeed, which today everybody is talking about, the COVID-19 pandemic and its impact on the economies, and also countries that are suffering. It's very important to see the most vulnerable amongst us, how they're dealing with that. So I'm going to divide my intervention on 4 key points. A very brief introduction I'm going to give about the G7 Plus, which I am chairing the group of the acceding members in an accession division of WTO. And also afterwards, in my second intervention, I'm gonna focus on the, very briefly, on the impact of the COVID-19 and pandemic on the economies of these so-called fragile and conflict-affected countries. And third, as a case study, I'm gonna present the Afghanistan's experience with this, how we are dealing with it, and what's the lessons learned as an example of one of the post-conflict, or some cases in conflict country. And then last but not least, I'm gonna leave with a few points how we can move on and deal with this. So what should be taken next? So starting with the G7 Plus, it's an association of the conflict affected and fragile countries, which have been established back in 2010 in Dili, the capital of the Timor-Leste. And the reason was to actually manage the transformation from conflict to a next level of development, where they could sustain and have more stability politically and economically, and addressing their fragility by integrations in the international trade. And then we in the WTO established a subgroup of that larger small G7 Plus group back in 2017. Afghanistan, with our colleagues from the accession division from WTO Secretariat, we took this initiative to bring the peace discussions within WTO framework. So we raised the concern of the countries that they are suffering from very special circumstances that they are dealing with the instability, with the conflict, armed conflict, with the poverty. So how the international trade could help them, how the WTO accession-related reforms, institutional buildings, and then overall legal framework reform could support these countries and these fragile and conflict-affected countries to integrate in the international trade. And of course, as a peer learning, the countries that they acceded WTO, like Afghanistan, Yemen, could support those they are in the process of accession, because our experiences are fresh and very kind of relevant to those they are in the accession, because they have facing, of course, different challenges. So the WTO accession should be kind of tailored based on their circumstances, not demanding too much of them to do. So that is on the G7 Plus, I just wanted to mention. And the second point, the impact of why we are discussing the WTO accession, and then the impact of COVID-19 on these countries, on the countries with the conflict and with the fragility. Look at the experience of the modern world, the so-called the developed and advanced countries. They have huge problem with other things than this problem, this pandemic. And now with all their advanced equipments, their infrastructures, their very strong healthcare system and governments system, they are some extent failing to address this and this pandemic outbreak and its impact on their economy. And now we look at the countries that they are actually not having that. They are suffering from fragility. They have a problem with even the basics, the security, the problem with the good governance or rule of law, or they're suffering from a very widespread poverty and huge unemployment or revenue shortages. So they are already having so many problems, these countries, that makes them to being very vulnerable to any external shocks, and especially with the pandemics. That is why I think this webinar and the subject of today's discussion is very important and relevant to focus on how we can respond for their needs, and how we can take proper measures at the global level and as well regional and national level to address their specific circumstances. So these countries already have these challenges. And now this pandemic, of course, posing a very existential and disproportionality new challenges. So now, what would be the impact, economic impacts on this economy of these post-conflict countries? I listed few of them. For instance, the suspension of cross-border trade and transit, especially for the landlocked developing countries and least developed countries, which are fragile and post-conflict also in the meantime. That creates a lot of problem for them, and that raises the price for the goods, especially for the food goods and for the medical equipments and drugs. And as well as that creates a problem with the revenue, because most of this country, they are mostly relying on the revenue from the customs duties. So by suspension of cross-border trade and transit, that means these countries are not collecting any revenue. So in case of Afghanistan, for instance, 96% of our revenue at the customs level have been declined and decreased, and 30% of the other taxation. And then the second suffering is on the businesses by closing down, by implementing curfews and confinements. Of course, the businesses are closed, and if they are closed, and that will have directly impact on their owners and on their workers, especially the micro and small, medium-sized enterprises, which most of the economy of these conflict-affected countries are run by these sectors. And informal businesses and their workers, informal workers, all of them are actually suffering from this, and those that you are living by the daily wages. And rising unemployment rate is another consequence of the widespread pandemic in these countries. And then the other part also, when we talk about the revenue, the remittances that these countries, the population of these countries are receiving from their relatives who are living in the developed countries in Europe or United States or UK and elsewhere. So these remittances have been actually decreased, because in those countries also the lockdown caused the shutdown of their businesses, and they are not receiving their salaries, and they are not receiving salaries, they cannot support their families back at their homes. And for instance, in case one case of the Somali is receiving 40% of the Somali population are receiving remittances from their relatives abroad. And 50% of these remittances, transferring of these payments have been decreased. So that has a lot of impact on the purchasing power of these households. And of course, that overall creates a lot of economic and social problems. And disruption of the global value chain is another consequence of this, because, disregard where of this on the line of the global value chain you are, by suspension of trade and stopping the production of the manufacturing establishments, that means your value chain, that your value addition has been not anymore used, and your raw materials, your workers and your manufacturing will be also impacted. And then the cost of handouts and special protective measures and economic stimulus schemes that these countries might taking, it has a devastating impact on their already fragile economic and revenues. And then on the investment side, the FDI flow has been also impacted in countries, and the businesses, individual investors, they are holding their investments in these countries, and then that creates a huge problem. So that brings me to the point that I'm going to mention about the Afghanistan case. More specifically, in Afghanistan, we are, we are a landlocked country and also in conflict indeed. We are suffering from a current existing armed conflict. And we experienced this pandemic in a very crucial time where we are fighting indeed as well as with the insurgents. In the meantime, we are fighting with the corona virus spread and outbreak. And right now there are more than 5,300 active cases and more than 130 dead. And that impacted a lot our economy, the curfews, the lockdown measures, those outcomes that I mentioned before, all of them in one way or another has experience in Afghanistan. And then that impacted also not only our economy, it also exacerbated the overall security circumstances, unfortunately. The conflict has been increased. The insurgent groups, Taliban, the Al-Qaeda, the Daesh, other terrorist groups, they have been increased their terrorist attack on civilians, on our infrastructures, especially on the energy lines, the transitional lines. We are importing electricity from Uzbekistan. Recently, they attacked 2 towers of these transmission lines. So that means that created extra burdensome for Afghan government and Afghan people. And just yesterday, unfortunately, they carried on 2 attacks. One on the Martinal Hospital, where the newborn babies have been killed with their mothers, and similar, and then a funeral ceremony in the eastern Afghanistan. There was another attack where dozens casualties have been reported. So this situation we are facing on different front challenges. The economic fronts with regards of the poverty, the unemployment rate, lack of revenue, and loss of revenue, and then on the security front, the exacerbation of the new attacks, and then we have also, because of the election, some political uncertainty as well this country is experiencing. Thanks to the Afghan government's timely measures that have taken, we somehow contain the spread of the virus. But unfortunately, we are very vulnerable because of the returning of the refugees. The Afghans, they're living in Iran and Pakistan because they lost their jobs, that now they're returning to Afghanistan. And then their return are not properly actually checked in terms of the coronavirus case. And that creates more kind of possibility where that we makes us vulnerable. So in past months, more than 270,000 Afghans, they have been returned from Iran and Pakistan. That shows how devastating the situation is in Afghanistan. And of course, that pushed us to think about out-of-the-box measures and make sure that we are mitigating the risk. And there are certain social disorders, protests. Some protests had been gone beyond the control, and it has some casualties. For instance, one in the western province of Afghanistan called Ghor, and the grievances of the people on the distribution of the food reliefs caused four death. So that shows how vulnerable we are. I mean, this economic implication and political uncertainty and security risk that this country is going through, that creates a lot of problem for these countries' governments and the people to address the challenge. So. And I also, of course, the international community thankfully lend their helping hand. I want to thank them. For instance, World Bank, IMF, European Union, the United States, the UK were amongst the first who supported Afghanistan and Afghan government to deal with this situation. Of course, the needs are dire, and based on one estimation from the Ministry of Public Health, the chance of getting infected in Afghanistan is so high that 80% of the population might get infected. That means 25 million Afghans, and with the more than 100,000 of deaths. And our current Minister of Public Health has been infected amongst other key high-ranking officials. So this is the overall situation in Afghanistan with regards to the COVID-19. So let me come to my last point, which is what should be done. It's very important to make it our strategy to fight this to be coherent and then a global level. Why global level? Because none of the individual states on this planet will not be capable to fight this and bear the burdensome and the cost of the pandemic and its aftermath impacts. So that's why that requires at two levels. At the national level, these conflict-affected and fragile states should take measures. And then at the global level, at the national level, it's very important that these countries are mobilizing the whole country's resources, and as well as and taking whole government measures, approaches in order to have a synchronized approach to addressing the pandemic in terms of the planning, carrying the planning, and then overseeing and then measuring the success and then learning from experiences. And of course, they have to make sure that their most vulnerable people, the children, the jobless, and those that they are living on the base of the daily wages are protected. And then appealing the international community, and then for the help and support. And it's very important that raising the awareness of the population about the impact of the coronavirus, and then how they should be cope with that, and then and there should be a very clear, transparent way of communication. And then supporting the businesses through the financial support or regulatory supports to mitigating their costs and their losses. And at a global level, of course, this is very important, my last point, that we have to have the similar approach, and it should be taking serious their circumstances and negligence against their situation of these countries that they are already suffering from different vicious factors could cause them harm. So this is very important that we have a global agenda, and then it should be coordinated in a better manner, and that financial support and technical support should be provided from the rich nations and from those countries that they have experiences in the coping with the pandemic. And of course, we should make sure that the trade is flowing, and if the FDI is flowing, we shouldn't stop that, and that will help them a lot in terms of the revitalizing their value chain industries, and then their exports. And we have to support the UN call for the ceasefire. This is something that we have to do in order to support these countries. And then last but not least, supporting the G7 and G7 Plus Secretariat, in particular their recent statements on this pandemic, which they call for a debt relief through waiving interest payments and using the heavily and debt poor countries. So by doing this, it will help these countries to cope with this. Otherwise, if we think inwardly and then so-called taking approaches like me first, will not help anybody. And thank you very much for your attention. I'm looking forward for any questions if there are any.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Thank you. I will hand it quickly over to Luisa. Luisa, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Diana, and thank you very much to the EAF Secretariat for hosting this webinar. I think His Excellency Ambassador Haqjo have very eloquently stated all the challenges that countries affected by fragility are facing at this moment. Indeed, these countries suffer for a number of vulnerabilities and of risk, whether economic and natural disaster, violence, and the impact of these risks when they hit is amplified by a very weak capacity to manage those risks in the first place, but also to mitigate its consequences. The COVID-19 pandemic has so far really translated in most low-income and middle-income countries, including fragile contexts, as a multiplicity of external shocks resulting from the overall, the global economy implications of the pandemic in major economic centers, whether China, the European Union, and the United States. And also the implication of that also in the financial systems, as these countries have been affected by the pandemic and take measures to respond to it. Now, certainly, won't be the first time that some of these external shocks hit these countries. But why is COVID-19 in a way different and has, mobilized the way it has the international community? But for once, it's because the impacts are very huge. We're talking of most of the countries in the world now being affected in a way or another. The health, the pandemic is in every country, but some of these major economic centers has been hit almost simultaneously, and also through supply and demand shocks, which is actually amplifying the impacts. So if we take just a few examples as well as to add to what the ambassador mentioned, the fall in commodity prices of many LDCs and other fragile countries depend on just a few commodities for their exports. If we think of oil in particular, the price has fallen by more than 60% this year. If we think of a country like South Sudan, for example, that oil represents 98% of its export revenue, this has some major implications for the government revenue and its capacity to respond to the health emergency. Moreover, this shock intervenes at a time where the aspirations of the population are very high, or the expectations are very high, as a new government, revitalized government of national unity, was established in February. And of course, the population is hoping that their socioeconomic conditions will improve after years of conflict. Timor-Leste, also a fragile country member of the G7+, they have a petroleum fund that is invested in international markets that they use to finance vital infrastructure, and also they've been using to respond to the COVID-19 emergency. Well, the value of those investments has fallen because of the financial market implications of the overall pandemic and the measures that have been taken in major economic centers to address the crisis. As was mentioned also by the ambassador, remittances has fallen as economic activity in the US and the EU has slowed down. A country like Haiti, where remittances represent 35% of their GDP, they are coming, most 70% of them are coming from Haitians that are in the United States. And some of the estimates is that the overall remittances will fall this year by 9%. Of course, with 6 million people already living below the poverty line, and months of political instability with high inflation, you can see the implications that lower remittances may have in very vulnerable populations. So all these impacts, external shocks, exacerbate also underlying vulnerabilities or unresolved conditions. One major concern at the moment with the COVID-19 crisis is that it can exacerbate food insecurity because of both issues about the availability of food, the supply chain being affected, production, but also the access to food in terms of the people losing their livelihoods, lower revenues, etc. So the World Food Programme estimates that by the end of the year, there may be 265 million people under acute food insecurity. And this is almost double the estimate previous to the COVID-19 pandemic. Of course, conflict as well is a major driver of food insecurity. Yemen is a case in point. There are 14 million people in urgent need of food assistance in the country, and vital infrastructure that is necessary to make that assistance available to displaced populations and others has been damaged over years of conflict. There are some also ongoing crises parallel to the COVID-19. If we think of the locusts outbreak in East Africa, it's also having a major implication for food production and food security in already vulnerable countries like Djibouti or Somalia that are already food insecure. Now, as the pandemic spreads, and it's already in many developing countries, then there will be other type of more endogenous risk that will flourish or kick in. For once, as was mentioned by the ambassador, weak health systems are insufficiently prepared to respond to the health emergency. So there is, for example, 1 physician and 8 hospital beds for 10,000 people in Democratic Republic of Congo. In Yemen, the figures are 3 physicians per 10,000 people. Half of the population in Yemen has no access to safe water and sanitation, and only 51% of the hospital or healthcare facilities infrastructure are truly operational. As was mentioned as well, access to supplies from equipment to PPPs, personal protection equipment, are difficult to come by and expensive. And of course, some trade measures like export restriction have not helped facilitate access to that. Key priority are protecting the health of health workers, mobilizing community to be able to respond in similar ways that was done during the Ebola outbreak in West Africa. And another major consideration is also ensuring that other health services, treatment and vaccination, maternal health care can continue, because as we know and has been indicated by the Secretary General and other organizations, actually during the Ebola in West Africa, the Ebola outbreak in West Africa, more people die because of lack of access to regular treatment, vaccination, etc., than from the Ebola itself. The second, more domestic risk that may trickle is, of course, all the measures that may need to be taken to and are being taken to suppress the spread of the disease. In a context of very high informality, widespread poverty, institutional weaknesses, cultural threats that make social distancing difficult to implement, sustaining this measure for a long time will be quite complicated. Also, in the context of fragile environments, the way some of these measures are implemented could arise or could lead to additional risk. For example, emergency measures or legislation have been adopted to be able to coordinate better and provide a more effective response. But in fragile political environments, those kind of legislation or the way they are implemented may raise issues. The enforcement of movement restrictions by security forces could also generate problems. So all of these elements need to be managed very, very carefully. And in a way, as the disease is only spreading in a number of these low-income and fragile contexts, we're gonna see more of this dilemma, possibly, and that is why it's very important that as support comes and a response is developed domestically at the national level and with partners, that a fragility kind of lens is used so that we can understand all the different fault lines about a response, and to make sure that those measures help to build resilience over the long term rather than undermine it. So for example, if we're going to provide assistance, the very urgent assistance that may be needed to support incomes and livelihoods, we need to make sure that those that are needed the most receive it, and that this is not used to discriminate groups or around ethnic lines and others. So it's very important that all the different dimensions are taken into account. So very briefly, the UN with partners in the broader international community have of course mobilized to support countries. There are 3 key elements. One is of course the direct health emergency and responding to the health needs. Second, ensuring that humanitarian assistance continues and that the people in need does receive the assistance that they require, and also addressing the socioeconomic fallout of this crisis. The Secretary General has also launched a global ceasefire, an appeal for a global ceasefire that is being discussed in the Security Council of the UN. Within the broader UN joint effort, UNDP has also developed its own response in the areas that we can better serve our partner countries. Strengthening health system is one. UNDP is helping countries to procure some of these equipment and health supplies, providing ICT technologies to facilitate payment of salaries to health workers, managing health waste, for example. All of this we have done already in the context of the Ebola outbreak. Providing inclusive crisis response, helping government continuity for core services of government, for example, facilitating coordination of the response at country level, given our local footprint in many developing countries. And the third element is the socioeconomic impact assessment and a response, helping countries think through how to care for the most vulnerable population, the poorest, maybe adapting some of the social protection programs, working, of course, with many partners in the UN, the World Bank, and others in the impact assessment that will identify better those needs. So we see a critical need to ensure that there is a global coordinated response, as the Secretary General has called for, including a global ceasefire would be very helpful in conflict settings to be able to reach the population and to do an effective response to the pandemic. And there is also an opportunity to build better, to create the foundation for more resilient and sustainable societies. And in terms of this response, this is also something that we are trying to also integrate in our response. Thank you very much.
Okay. Great. Thank you so much, Luisa. And I just wanted to flag that I'm seeing a lot of great questions come in. So please do continue to submit your questions via the Q&A function. Immediately following Paul, will be starting off with the question and answer session. So over to you, Paul.
Thank you very much. And then good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody. I think as we started, fragility is, if we don't address the fragility issue, we won't be able to end extreme poverty. So the two are inextricably linked. And that challenge is going to become even more pronounced given the number of young people who are going to need jobs. So there's a real jobs challenge that's linked to fragility. And trade can play a key role in delivering those jobs and delivering the economic transformation that will be essential to provide new and good quality jobs that young people in countries, in developing countries will need. But trade also brings challenges. It can also exacerbate conflict, particularly where there are products like minerals over which armed groups are fighting for control, and trade increases the value of those minerals. So trade is part of the solution, but it's also part of the problem of fragility and links into issues of governance and economic diversification out of those activities. I just want to talk a little bit this morning about work we've been doing in the Great Lakes region of Africa. That region was a real violence hotspot 10, 15 years ago. It's not so much in the news these days. There's still huge challenges, but the level of violence has come down. And trade has been an important part of that. Of course, for landlocked countries, fragility has regional implications. Violence very rarely ends at the border. It spills over. So there are regional implications, and cooperation is part of the solving these issues. And trade is a vital element that links communities across borders. So we've been working in the Great Lakes, where cross-border trade between the DRC and Rwanda, the DRC and Uganda, is a critical aspect of the economies of those regions, and a critical aspect that leads to employment and activities for many of the poorest people, and also people who've been displaced. Trade is one of the easiest mechanisms for which IDPs can integrate and get a living. And also the majority of those traders are actually women. So there are additional benefits there that cross-border trade brings. We know from sort of surveys and focus groups that the revenues that women, particularly women traders, are getting is spent on health of their families, on education of their children, and on nutrition. Just as an example, one border between the DRC and Rwanda at Goma, Rubavu, between 40 and 50,000 people in the past were crossing that border every day. Now, the challenges that we see, and I think this is typical of fragile states, is that borders are often have very poor infrastructure. Policies and procedures are often unclear, and governance is very poor. And these are sort of issues that we've been trying to address and are critical to allow trade to fulfill its function in these countries. So improving border infrastructure, the facilities for customs officials, for border officials, building border markets where people can come together, etc. Improving the procedures, making them transparent, making them simple, and making them clear. And I think, as the ambassador said, that when that happens, we see that trade much more becomes a revenue generator. it's actually not, it becomes more effective to collect revenue, a small amount of taxation on a large amount of trade than the other way around. So trade has become actually an important, small-scale trade has become an important generator of revenues in these countries. And then also improving governance, providing training to officials, providing training to traders on what their rights and their obligations are. And that has just led to a much better environment for trade at these borders. So we've seen increasing numbers of small-scale traders. Now, unfortunately, COVID has arisen and is causing particular problems. Countries have been very keen to keep trade flowing, but they've been focusing on trucks. And of course, it's easier to allow trucks to move and to sort of social distance, etc. When you have 50,000 people crossing a border, that's a real challenge. And those borders have been shut, and that is causing, I think, real challenges. What we're trying to do, and I think this is a little bit of how you move to the future, is to help small-scale traders consolidate their loads together so that they can together get a lorry load, which can then cross the border. And that is actually a very important step towards sort of more formal activities and more efficiency across the border. But thinking about how to allow small-scale traders to continue operating, they are critical in providing food security. A lot of the products that they carry are food, and we are seeing issues with regard to access to food and food price spikes in a lot of countries. So this is something we can't ignore, but they are also conduits for medical products, including essentials like soap, and they're a real part of dealing with the pandemic. So I think looking to the future, small-scale trade is a critical part of a lot of the situation in a lot of fragile countries. How do we support that trade whilst also ensuring safety and limiting the spread of COVID is the challenge that faces us now. In the longer term, when COVID's gone, it's how to support those traders become more formal, delivering more jobs. And of course, as they create more jobs in logistics, transport, that offers alternatives to the youth for joining in armed groups, etc., and provides the basis for sort of the economic transformation that will lead to the end of the fragility of those regions. Let me stop there. I've been very brief, but I think it'd be good to get some conversation and some discussion. Thanks very much.
Great, great, Paul. Thank you so much. Yeah, we're running a little bit short on time, but I'm going to start posing the questions that we've received from our live audience. And if we can just maybe try to keep our answers as brief as possible so we can cover as many of these questions that we have. And so the first one I actually wanted to ask, maybe we can start with Luisa. This is about something that we haven't quite touched upon so far. It's the environmental elements of this crisis and how it impacts fragile countries and causes countries to become fragile. So Sheila is wondering how we can also address things like environmental issues and disasters when we're looking at building resilience in these countries.
Yeah, I think certainly the fact that COVID-19, the pandemic has hit doesn't mean that all the other vulnerabilities are not there. And the environment and the climate change kind of pending crisis is also a major concern and a major area of vulnerability for many of the fragile countries. There are the natural disasters and other environmental degradation makes population move and be displaced, and this is part of the, it's one of the additional vulnerabilities that these countries have to face, and I think in terms of the response and in line with the Sustainable Development Agenda, a very coherent approach needs to be taken to building resilience, which includes all these different elements, social, environmental, economic resilience, so that countries can sustain over time development gains. So it's not only, and I think this is one of the challenges that we are now facing, that there is a lot of concentration, of course, on COVID and its implications. But the issues raised by climate change and other environmental challenges does not go away. We need to continue taking action and ensuring that the response to COVID itself will be one that allows building global resilience also to other challenges. So for instance, in the response, global response, but also those that are taken locally, how can we build more resilient economies in terms of the sectors that are being supported and the measures that are taken to mobilize resources, etc. Over.
Great. Thank you, Luisa. And then moving quickly on, I have a question from Guy, and maybe this can go to Paul. This is more about the international response that's required. So Guy has mentioned that the EU has raised something about 14 billion to just tackle the issue of the vaccine for COVID. But he's looking for what else is required. What else are international institutions doing in response aside from just looking at the vaccine issue?
Thank you very much. Well, one thing, and I think Luisa said we can advise countries not to do, first of all, is to put on export restrictions on medical products. That has particularly bad effects on fragile countries that don't have the capacity to produce or to distribute easily those products. So it's a very short-term adverse measure that actually doesn't lead to greater security in the longer term, and has particularly deleterious impacts in the short run. So a big don't from our point of view is for developed countries to put on restrictions on the supply of on the export of medical products and also on food. So that's a big don't. I think on a lot of the do's, yes, I think support to countries obviously in upgrading their health systems, etc. But in the short term on trade, it is to support countries to keep trading while controlling the spread of COVID. So sharing experiences, I think, on how to implement border control, but while minimizing, while maximizing social distancing, but minimizing delays is one issue. Maybe just one, I think, issue that will become more important is that new products will be developed to deal with COVID. New medical products will be, are obviously being developed for treatment, but as well as vaccines. Now, the challenge is how do countries regulate those, particularly fragile countries. It's important that those products are safe for their people, but they often don't have the infrastructure, the scientists, etc., to be able to properly implement regulations, etc. So I think sharing of information from those countries that are developing those products, helping fragile countries to understand those products and to be able to get those products distributed as quick as possible is going to be crucial in the coming months. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Paul. And so the next question is from Ibrahim, and I think it's for the ambassador. And this is related to food security issues that we've been touching upon. And he's actually asking specifically about strategic grain reserves in developing countries and in fragile countries. So basically wanting to know what the impacts are we're seeing that's specifically about grain reserves and or food shortages. Ambassador?
Well, thank you. Thank you, Ibrahim. Assalamu alaikum. Thanks for that question. Well, the answer is depending on the different factors. One is timing, how long this pandemic will last. If it's gonna last longer than 6 months or years, so on, of course, the countries might think about their national food reserves, and they become more inward than providing export opportunity for their supply, for their surplus production. So this is a concern for developing countries, especially within WTO. We call the net food importing developing countries, that they are more vulnerable in this kind of circumstances, and that the intention is to make sure that the restrictions on the export of the essential food supply are not imposed, are imposed in a manner that not harming others. And then also depends on the countries how they kind of apply their diplomacy in a way to find their partners on a global supply market where they could get kind of secure access to these grains. Yes, I mean, this is a problem. He mentioned in questions that that might cause some conflict. Yes, depends on as I mentioned, too much on the timing, and if it prolongs, of course, the risk of regional conflicts on the food supply, not only at the international level, of course, within the nation borders as well. This is a problem. There are some part of the countries they're kind of disadvantaged geographically speaking because of the agricultural products. They might suffer from that, and the governments might be accused for the discriminatory distribution of food supplies and food goods. This is something that we have seen in the past in the fragile and conflict African countries. So this is exactly what I mentioned, that we need a global approach, a coherent and synchronized together with these countries to support them, to build their capacity, to actually share a helping hand to cope with the situation. Otherwise, if they're left alone, the cost of inaction or poor action would be much higher. So if we act earlier, that will be much cheaper.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Ambassador.
Yeah.
And then the next question I'll give to Luisa. This is from Ananta, and this is about we've been talking a lot about international support measures and how they're definitely very necessary. But Ananta is actually wondering about less top-down measures and how to engage with people at the local level, whether that be people living in informal settlements, refugee spaces, things like that. So how can we sort of engage people at the local level, whether it be local government level or sort of informally community groups? What are the different ways that we can work from that angle?
Yeah, no, I think this is a very good point, and it would be critical for the success of the response to the COVID-19 and for the general success of development programs, in the sense that in fragile contexts, because there are all these governance or institutional weaknesses, people make up for themselves in a way. So the community organizes itself and finds ways to have access to services and to cope with situations of crisis. So there are certain mechanisms in the community, and it's important that when international support comes, those mechanisms are understood and leveraged to provide effective response. So for instance, during the Ebola outbreak in West Africa, there was a critical issue because there are elements also of stigma and lack of trust on what the disease is, and the measures that are being required, which imply behavioral changes. Why is this imposed on us if if there is mistrust? So you need to work really through the community as trust kind of ambassadors to that community to convey key messages on the response to the disease, but also to listen and to understand how the community can build on those structures that they have set up for longer term resilience. So certainly a critical issue is listening, understanding, and leveraging the structures that the community itself has developed, rather than trying to substitute it. Yeah. Thanks.
Okay, great. Thank you, Luisa. And we're a couple minutes away from our scheduled time to close, but I think we can take a few more questions and maybe run over a few minutes longer. I have a question here for Paul from Sheila, and this is related to regional arrangements for giving out aid. I mean, Paul, you were speaking about this work with informal cross-border trade in the Great Lakes region. So Sheila is talking about would regional ways of working also be successful, whether South Asia, West Indies, mutual assistance networks? Do you have any ideas related to sort of like regional or outside national borders work?
Thank you. Sorry, I was struggling with the mute button.
The video's off.
Okay, I pressed the wrong button, obviously. Okay, sorry, my fat fingers. I think that's a very good point. I mean, information is critical in things like the pandemic, and you know, countries can come together to more effectively share information so that people are aware of the risks, but also share information on how to deal with those risks, and come together to share the costs of those risks. So, you know, one of the issues that we've seen is a real challenge is getting access to some of the medical equipment. Ventilators has obviously been in the news. Now, you know, for example, in Africa, 54 countries trying to buy ventilators, it would be a real issue. But if countries came together, they could have more effectively managed their purchases and their dealings with the suppliers to get better prices, etc. So that's one example, I think, where countries can coming together to allow medical personnel to move quickly across borders, so that again you can maximize the medical response to hotspots. Is another example, I think, where countries can work together in organizing the response to the pandemic. Thanks.
Okay, great, thanks. And then I have a question for the ambassador about working with minority groups for peace building. I wonder if you have any thoughts about ways to, you know, support resilience in fragile states.
Sure, yes, this is a very crucial point, especially when you are having conflict, armed conflict, and building the trust between citizens and the government is key to the success. And especially the most vulnerable and the minority factions. This helps the government to reach out them and then listen to their grievances, and then intervene with them in a way and communicate with them in a way that their concerns are rightly, properly incorporated in their government approaches when it comes with the peace, because of course, as war, the peace also has winners and losers, but we should make sure that justice is there, and then that those that are suffering from any negative consequences of the peace on some part of the populations, that should be mitigated, and make sure that they handle it properly in a way that it is sustainable.
Great. Okay, thank you so much, Ambassador. And so just to wrap up, I wanted to end with a question for you all that's trying to look at it from a more hopeful note. I mean, we're in this space right now where we're all living in this pandemic, and I wonder if, looking at the response to better supporting fragile states, we can find hope for new opportunities, whether that be new paradigms for work or new ways to respond. Maybe Luisa, since I know you have to leave very soon. Your mic is off.
Yes, sorry, it was my turn, Paul. Yeah, no, I think certainly something that we can all learn from countries affected by fragility is about the resilience of the population. How they find ways to organize, as I was referring before, in terms of their community approaches, etc. So, you know, there is always hope, and people are very resilient. I think that as an international community, we have, however, a major responsibility to respond to the needs of the most vulnerable. And there are a number of key steps that need to be taken. As I had mentioned, there is a critical need to ensure that humanitarian assistance will be available and will continue, and all those that need it will receive it. And also taking into account the socioeconomic fallout of the crisis. And there we can also build the condition for a more sustainable economy and for more sustainable societies as we take this major crisis as a possibility as well to do things differently. The crisis as well is showing how interdependent we are, and there is a lot of concern that globalization will, won't be the same, or we are deglobalizing. But at the same time, the pandemic has shown how interdependent we all are, and underscore the need precisely to this global response. So there is also maybe when things settle, this reality will also help us to work in a better coordinated fashion, building the future. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Luisa. And then maybe I'll hand it over to Ambassador. Also, this same question, what can we find hope during a pandemic?
Yes, definitely. This pandemic actually has also a positive aspect of it to look at the way we are dealing with our governments, with our laws, with our natural resources, and the way we are dealing with the circumstances, not being too much visionary and always living on a daily basis. So it's important that we prepared, especially from conflict perspective. It's important that have preventing measures helps to take advance. So the same would apply for the prevention of any conflict. So that translates and conveys a message to the global community that the same way we are taking preventive measures for the spread of virus, we could also take preventive measures for the spread of conflicts in those countries that they are fragile and conflict affected. And of course, another way also, this is very good lessons learned for these countries, that to become sustainable, to think that because of the lockdown, because of the challenges of the trade, has been suspended. So they are facing with a shortage of the supply, and the inflation is going high. And that means that you have to think about the possibility to be more productive and having certain national reserves and then production capacity within the country, and focusing on key industries, and then having something, plan B for the circumstances as such.
Okay, great. Thank you, Ambassador. Okay, Paul, we'll give you the last word. Where can we find
you? Thank you very much. Well, I'm an optimist, I guess. So I think what the pandemic is showing can be the extreme costs of the lack of cooperation across countries. And perhaps looking forward, we'll go to a new area of much greater cooperation to address the risks from pandemics, from climate change, etc. Thanks.
Okay, wow, that was short and sweet. Thank you. And with that, we've run a few minutes over. Sorry about that, but I want to just again thank our speakers, thank the audience so much, and also thank you to the EIF team behind the scenes who have helped get this all off the ground. We are having our second webinar. This was our first attempt. This was our inaugural attempt. Our second one will be on May 28th. The topic will be least developed country graduation and how COVID-19 may or may not be impacting those timelines. Once this webinar ends, there'll be a short survey. So if you stick around, just 2 or 3 questions, please do answer that. And otherwise, I will sign off. Thank you again to everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.